how to troubleshoot security issues. So I'm making an assumption that basically you've already know how to assign security roles to a user and add a new user, that type of thing. So what I'm going to go over is when a user gets a denied message, what does that look like in RTC, and I'll also do it in Classic as well. And then we'll kind of discuss, okay, if a user's getting this message, then how do you find what roles contains that permission? If you have a role that contains that permission, do you want to give that person that role, that type of thing? So. Okay, so if you have any questions as I'm going along, just feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I'm going to be using both the role-tailored client in NAV 2009 and the Classic client. So what I'm logged on as the Classic client, I'm logged on as an administrative user, which is different from the Windows authenticated user that I'm using in the role-tailored client to do my testing. So the first thing is I'm going to talk about is I've set up a scenario where I have a user who should be able to enter an agency order. For non-Ceres users, that would be a sales order, but they can't post it. When they go to enter that agency order, they're receiving an error message that says they don't have some type of permission. So actually, I should back up. Trying to resolve this issue, if you are setting up new security, so you're brand new and you're putting in security roles, this process is really an iterative process, and so it really kind of requires a lot of coordination with your user. I usually kind of recommend, if it's the single error, this user is trying to do this, that's fairly easy to do without the user present. I usually recommend, if you're establishing security, that you get yourself and the user in the same room so they can show you what they are experiencing, because a lot of times users will say, I'm getting a permissions error. That's all they tell you. I always say, well, okay, they need to give the text of the error, a screenshot is always helpful, but also the process is sort of like they may have one error, you add the necessary permissions, they try to do the process again, they may get a second error, because NAV doesn't test the security for the entire process. It goes along until it finds an error. At the point it finds the error is when it stops. So once you resolve that permissions issue and they try the process again, they may get another error. So it may take you a couple quote unquote go rounds to resolve the issue. So a lot of times, since it's an iterative process, being in the same place is a much more efficient way than to say, okay, I've changed your security, try it again, then they email you back, and okay, now I'm getting this error message, that type of thing. That can be fairly frustrating for the user as well. And usually, once you have the permissions worked out for a particular profile, in this case a user who is trying to basically enter an agency order, that will apply to all your other users that should do the same thing. So when NAV or Ceres gives you a security denied message, sometimes in the role-tailored client here, sometimes that security message, denial message, is not as clear as it is in the Classic client. So a lot of times when you're trying to do something in the Classic client, or when somebody's trying to do something, you may need to have them do that process in the Classic client in order for them to, for it to give you a cleaner, clearer message. So, so let's go ahead and go ahead and run through the first scenario. So I'm a user. I'm going to try to do an agency order. So I'm going to go to agency orders, agency order processing. And I'm just going to do a new agency order. So far, haven't had any permissions issues. I'm going to grab an agency number, and I'm going to get a message that their monitoring has expired. All right. I'm going to give it a shopper. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to select an item. And I'm going to grab my Missouri cheese that I know I have in stock. And I'm going to go ahead and put in a quantity. I want 5 of those. All right, so immediately we can see when I enter the quantity that I've got a red X. And so that leads me to the top of the screen, and it says you do not have permission to read the grant allocation line table. So when a user has a permissions issue, they're always going to get the format of you do not have permission to read, insert, modify, delete, and then it will be the table name. So what you need to obtain from your user is, the key here is, in this case, permission to read, and the table is the grant allocation line table. So a lot of times users just say, well, I'm getting a permissions error, and they're not specific on what they're trying to do. Now, in RTC, when I do a refresh on it, the table, it will tell me it again that I do not have permission to read the grant allocation line table, and then it tells me that the current page that I'm on must close. Okay. So now we know we've got an error message. So we know that the user can't read the grant allocation line table. So the first thing we do is we switch over to the classic client. And what we need to find out is what roles have the grant allocation line table in it. And that is usually a challenge. So if we go to Tools, Security, and Roles, we can see that we have a whole bunch of roles. And if I look through here, I don't really see anything that tells me I see a grant setup one. So the first thing would be to go through your roles and kind of determine which one is the most likely candidate. Now, unfortunately, you have to select that particular role and come over here and do permissions to see, does it have the grant allocation line table in it? That's really the hard way, because I'd have to go through every single role to find out which security role has that permission in it. So there is a table in Classic that will tell us all of the roles that contain this particular the grant allocation line. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to Tools and Object Designer, and the first thing we need to find out is what is the table ID of the grant allocation line. So I'm going to search through the name filter. I'm just going to do a find. I got to spell it right. Okay, so grant allocation line, that table number, and this is the key piece, is 1401224. So that is the table ID, and that we're going to need that if we're going to modify our permissions or if we're going to find out which roles have it. So once I have found my the table ID or the object ID that's trying to be accessed, we go to the very bottom of the tables just by doing a Control-End. And what we're looking for in Object Designer is table 2 with a whole bunch of zeros and ends in 5. It's actually the permissions table. So I'm going to go ahead and run this table. So you have to have access to Object Designer. So this is making an assumption that you're an administrative type user to find out which roles have that. You know, if a user is trying to post an agency order or a sales order or purchase order, it's fairly obvious that there is a posting role that you can add, and I'll circle back when we get this resolved to show you how you add that. So this is the way if you don't know what role contains that particular object. So I'm going to run this, and I'm going to filter in my object ID. I'm going to type in that table number. So, and we are looking for the table data. So in this case, that table data lives in 3 different roles. It lives in the series edit, which is a series specific role that we're phasing out. It's in the series read, again, which is a series specific role that we're phasing out. And it's also in the grant setup. So in this case, grant setup is the only role that contains this particular, the access. So we can see that we have these fields here: read, insert, modify, and delete. What we're looking for is we're looking for this particular table in a role that has read permission. So let's go ahead and, so now we've identified a role, grant setup. Let's go back to our tools, security and roles, and let's look at the grant setup. So I'm on my grant setup. I'm going to look for roles and permissions. So if you notice, grant setup does a whole lot of things. So this is an order entry type person, so I probably don't want them to have access to create, insert, modify, and delete grants, grant ledger entries, grant out. So it does have access to grant allocation line, but it has full access. So the error message that we got was that we didn't have the ability to read it. So what I would be looking for is a role that had a permission for the grant allocation line where the insert, modify, and delete were blank. If that's the case, then that's the minimum permission that I'm going to be able to give this person. Now, if this person also is responsible for grants, then I could give them the grant setup role. But in this case, since they're an order entry person, that's probably not appropriate. So once we've identified that we don't have a existing role to give this user, we then have to decide, okay, we either, one, need to add this permission to an existing role that the user already has, or two, we need to create a custom role. So since this is an order entry person, all of my order entry people should probably be able to access the grant allocation line. So I'm going to go back to my tools, security, and Windows logins, and I'm going to select my user, and I'm going to see which roles they have. So this user has a whole bunch of roles. They can read agencies, they can read posted shipments, they can create agency orders, then they can read GL registers, they can edit parent agencies, they can read some other information. So most likely the action that they were doing at the time is they were trying to create an agency order, or for non-series users, a sales order. So it would make sense to me to put it into this role because that's what they were trying to do. So using the role name, this of course doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Division is a little cryptic. A&R, that basically stands for agencies and receivables. -Q stands for quote, O stands for order, I stands for invoice, R stands for return order, C stands for credit memo. Basically, that still doesn't tell you much. What really tells you is in the role name. It's going to give you a description of what should they be able to do. So in this case, they should be able to create an agency order. So now I have to ask myself, okay, if I grant this person, if I put that grant allocation line table into this role, does it give somebody else who has that role permissions to do something that they shouldn't do? So that's the question you really have to answer. It's sort of a multi-pronged approach because you've identified the change you need to make. Then you need to say, okay, if I'm going to do an existing role, if I change it for this person, who else would I also be changing that for? To find that out, if we go back to Tools, Security, and Roles, if we find the role that we're looking for, so in this case it's A&R, over here under the Role button, I can see the Windows logins or the database logins of the users that have this. So if I click on Windows logins, I can see, oh, I only have one person, that's me. But if I have a list of users here, this is going to tell me if I make this change, it's also going to affect all of these other users. So you need to be aware of that when you make a change to an existing role is, who else am I giving this ability to? So in this case, single person. So I'm going to go ahead and modify that particular role. So I'm going to go to the role, and I'm going to click on permissions. And so this role has a whole bunch of permissions. So let's go all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to add my table data because table data is really access to the data, and that's the primary method that NAV uses to control access. We give you access to all the forms and pages, but we control what data you can access, what data you can insert, modify, and delete. So I previously wrote down the object ID when I did the search through the object designer, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. And when I tab out, it will give me the object name. So that's my confirmation that, yes, I've got my grant allocation line. That's the object that I meant to access. Now, by default, Ceres gives, whenever you add a permission to a role, Ceres or NAV will give you full access to it. So you always get, so it will set read, insert, modify, delete, and run, all of those to yes. So that may be too much access. So we know that we need read permission because our user gave us the error message that said you do not have the ability to read the agency order table, or I'm sorry, the grant allocation line when you're doing an agency order. So I know that my read permission here, and let's go ahead and expand this out a little bit, needs to be yes. And where did my agent say the grant allocation line? Okay, so, but since the error message did not say I needed to basically insert, modify, or delete, I would delete those permissions and make them blank. So basically the approach is we're giving the user the minimum level of security that they need in order to accomplish what they're after. Now, your options are you can specifically, blank means they don't have the access. Yes means you're granting them. The last one on the list is indirect. Now, you'll see a lot of lines here that are indirect. A lot of times, any of the ledger entries are indirect. What indirect basically means is if I went to a page that had the grant allocation line and my setting here is indirect, I still would not be able to insert into it. Indirect basically means some other process is accessing this table. So let's say it's a posting process or it's some type of, you click on functions to do something in NAV or Ceres. So indirect basically means the user's not making the change directly by typing data into a page or a form. Indirect is basically saying I still need to be able to access the data, but it has to happen through the system. The system is actually doing the insert into the table. Indirect is one of the most difficult permission sets to determine. Sometimes when I think if I get a permissions error, they say, okay, you don't have insert permission, so we will grant them indirect. That's always a very good place to start. But bear in mind, if you do give them indirect permission, that may not be sufficient. They may still need to be able to have, they may still have to have specific permissions granted. So in this case, I am going to grant them indirect permission because I believe since it's a line table that they may need, the system may need to access that. So now that I've made my change, to my role. If the user has that role, the only thing I need to do subsequent, if you're using Windows authentication, depending upon the way you're set up, is you may need to do a synchronize all logins. What that does is that will synchronize the security change that you just made through to SQL to grant the necessary permissions. Now, I have this database set up where it doesn't require a sync, so I'm not going to bother to synchronize all logins. But I do have to log off and back on. So I'm going to go ahead and log off. And I'm going to go log back on here.
William, while you're doing that, Lisa had a comment and a question.
Okay,
her
sorry.
version of NAV doesn't have the 2000 through the 5 permissions, and she is a super user. So is there should we take that offline, or?
No, I'll go over that as soon as I show you the change here in the role tailored. I'll go ahead and remove that permissions and do the same navigation just in Classic.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so now if I go to departments and I go back to order processing and I go to my agency order. Now my agency order already exists, so I got the error in trying to add my quantity on my item. So I'm going to go just to the bottom of the last agency order that I did. And when the page closed, it didn't save my item. So I'm going to reselect my item. Grab my Missouri cheese. And now, if I've done everything correctly, when I put in my quantity, I should get a quantity, and I'm able to write the line. I don't have any errors. So that tells me that I'm able to, that my permissions change resolve the issue. Now I may very well have, when I typed in the quantity, it may give me another message. If I have multiple security issues, I could resolve the grant allocation line, but maybe I don't have access to the job line or something along that lines. So just because you make one change doesn't necessarily mean that is going, it goes back to that iterative process. There may be multiple changes that need to be made. So any questions so far? Okay. So let me go back here. Let me get out of. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go ahead and remove that permission that I just added from that role. Do it F4, delete that. All right, so now that no longer has that permission. So if I log into the Classic client, I'm going to go with Windows authentication. I just need to find my testing database. Okay, so it's really the same thing. So now that I'm I'm going to go to Sales and Marketing. I'm going to go to Order Processing. I'll go to Orders. So immediately, if you notice when I clicked on Orders, it says it was trying to open it, and it says you do not have permission to read the grant allocation line table. So the message that you're going to get is the same regardless of whether you're in Classic or whether you're in RTC. The only difference is sometimes RTC will let you get further along in the process before it generates the actual error message. Classic is pretty immediate. It won't even let you open. I can't even get into orders. So the same thing, if I go back through the same process, I go to my Object Designer, find Grant Allocation Line, find out what that object is and say, oh, okay, there's my object ID. Now again, I need to figure out what role I want to put that in. So in this case, I could create a new role. So let's do the, if I looked and I said, you know, I only have one order entry person that deals with grants, so I don't want that this grant allocation line table to be in this role of the create agency orders. So in this case, my only other option is to say, okay, if I added that role, that permission to this role, I'm giving other people more access than I want to. So my other option is to find either another user role that only my specific user has, an existing role, or create a custom role. I usually recommend creating a custom role because if you modify an existing role, that is a good idea if you're fairly confident that, yes, for instance, I'm modifying this role. I want anybody who can create an agency or a sales order to have access to that. If I'm pretty confident that anybody who now has it or may in the future, then modify an existing role. If I don't know that, then let's do a new role. I think, so creating a new security role, while it adds more to setup, it also gives you more control. So to create a new security role, we just do an F3 or hit the new icon to insert a new role. And so I'm going to call this grant ALLOC. And I'm going to give it a name of read grant, if I can spell it right, allocation line. So again, it's important that I do name it correctly so I know that when I'm granting it to a user that I've given them, that I know what that role is doing, because a lot of times the role ID is not specific enough. So once I've created my role, I go down to role and permissions. And it's basically the same process of adding it to as what I was adding to an existing role. Type in the role ID or the object ID. When I tab out, it will confirm that yes, grant allocation line is the one that I want. And I knew that I needed read permission. So in this case, I'm going to, instead of setting those to indirect, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do just the minimum, which is read and run. You'll also notice that run is grayed out. Whenever you add new permissions to a role, an existing role, or create a new role, run is always set to yes. There really wouldn't be any purpose to setting that to no. In fact, I'm not sure why it's even there. It defaults it to yes, and you can't change it because if you notice, it's got little dots around it. It's grayed out or non-editable. If you can't run the table, you can't access anything in it. So it's kind of that's kind of an interesting. The reason that it's even there. So in this case, I'm just going to set this to read permission. So now that I have permissions on that, my last step is to go to my user. So I go to Tools, Security, find my user login, and I'm going to add this grant setup role to this particular user. I'm sorry, this grant allocation role. So now that I've done that, again, if my database requires syncing, I may need to do a security synchronize all logins to make sure the underlying SQL gets accessed, updated. But again, until I log off, it doesn't become effective. So even though I've made the change, I made the change as an admin user, until my user logs off their current session and back on, NAV will not refresh because it reads the security during logon. So I'm back here, logged on is me. I'm going to go ahead and click on orders, and now we can see that, yep, I can go ahead and get into orders. So I was able to access that grant allocation line. Okay, so any questions on the classic piece of that? So in looking at this, if we go back to our role here, just because I have, I'm going to go ahead and go down to an order, just because I was able to get into it. If you remember, I did not add the indirect permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and grab another item. And that one has no quantity available. Gotta find my that one doesn't have any. Gotta find my Missouri cheese because I know that one has there we are. So when I put in quantity, I could get, so that basically told me when I put in a quantity and I did not get any permissions errors, that I did not need the indirect permissions on the insert, modify, and delete. So if I go back to my admin login and I go back to my security roles, this basically I did not need to. Previously I had put in indirect permissions in the various read, insert, modify, and delete. The fact that I'm able to get past the error message tells me that was not necessary. So it's always good to only give them the level of permission that they need. So let's talk a bit about what the various insert, modify, and delete means. So read basically allows you to read the contents, read the data that's in that particular table. If you can't read it, that's a minimum level. If you can't make any changes to it, you can't do any updates to it, but you can see it. So if you don't have read permission, then you can't even see that. So if I say didn't have read permission to the item table, when I would try to do a drill up here on the item number, NAV would give me a message that says you don't have read permission on the item, so I wouldn't even be able to see a list of items. Insert allows me to create new records. So if I have insert permission on the item table, I could create a new item. Now without modify, I could create a new item, but let's say I spelled the description wrong and I was going back to change that. If I don't have insert and modify, then I can't change it after I've created it. And in some cases that may be the desired, the desired result. So modify, so you may set up a scenario where you give somebody the ability to modify an existing record, but you don't give them insert or delete. So that allows them in our item example to go to an existing item, correct the description, but they couldn't create a new one. And then delete allows you to remove. So in this case, you could delete that item. Now, even if you have delete capability at the security level, that does not circumvent any system edits inside NAV Ceres. So for example, our item. If I have an item, say I have delete permission on the item table, if that item has transactions against it, even though my security says I can delete it, Ceres is going to prevent me from deleting it because I have transactions in the current year against that particular item. So even though you grant it at the security level, that still does not circumvent other system edits. Okay. So again, the two keys are when somebody tells you a message, they're going to give you it's going to come back with the table name. So the key is to find the actual table name and get its associated object ID, table number in essence. Once you have the table number, you can go all the way to the bottom. The easiest way is to just make sure you've clicked on tables, drag the slide bar all the way to the bottom until we get into the system level tables. And the one that you're looking for is the permissions table. So when we run that, that will tell us we can then filter for that particular table object to find out what roles contain that. That's by far the fastest way. Now, I can go, if I do know in roles, if I have an obvious candidate, for instance, I want to be able to grant this particular user that we just did the ability to post an agency order. Well, here is one that says post agency orders. So that is an obvious one that would allow me to, if I granted that user that capability, I'd be able to post that agency order. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go back to RTC. And now that I have the ability to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go to my agency order and try to post it. All right, so I've got a quantity. I'm going to go ahead and release my order. I'm going to go ahead and create, this is requires a pick, so I'm just going to go ahead and create my inventory pick and post it. Just to get to the point where I'm able to post my agency order. So just 1 second here. I'm going to tell it the quantity that I picked is 5. And I'm going to go ahead and post it. Now, I'm able to post a pick. So if we go back to our user and go to our user and check their roles, we can see that I have the ability to create a receipt and put away and pick, and I have the ability to post it. If I didn't have this post capability, I wouldn't be able to post my pick. But I am separating the ability to post the pick from the ability to post the order itself. So we'll go ahead and post our pick. So that allows you to get some granularity in your permissions. You can basically give people the ability to do exactly what you want them to do. All right, so our pick has been posted. So now if I try to post my agency order, so I've shipped my quantity of 5. I'm going to go ahead and click post, and I'm going to tell it to ship an invoice or invoice. Either one will work. So it tries to post, and immediately it comes in and says, whoa, you don't have permission to insert into the sales invoice header table. So again, the keys here are permission to insert and sales invoice header. So if we click OK, it will go ahead and close that page. So if we go and take a look at the roles that this person has, immediately we can see that there is a post agency order role. So that would be, I wouldn't bother going to the permissions table to find out which roles have the sales invoice header, because there's already a pre-configured role that gives me that. But what I would want to do is select that role and look at its permissions and determine, does it give me the ability to do things that I shouldn't? So if you notice, this has a lot of permissions. It's a pre-configured role. And what I would pay attention to in particularly is the delete permissions. If I grant this person a role, this role, does it give them the ability to delete something that I don't want them to? So for instance, I immediately see in this role sales comment lines. I have delete permission on sales comment lines. Maybe I don't. Maybe I do not want people to delete sales comment lines. So if that's the case, I would either, 1, not grant this person the ability to post agency orders, or 2, I would go into this role and remove the ability to delete sales comment lines. So that's just sort of an example. So it really takes some reviewing just to make sure that you're not giving somebody more permissions than you intend to. And that's the hardest one, because if you notice, the posting role contains a lot of permissions. It contains a lot of explicit things. A lot of them are system level, but some of them, like the comment lines and things like that, are things that you may or may not want somebody to be able to do. So I'm going to go ahead and grant this user the ability to post. So I'm going to go back to my role-tailored client, and I'm going to go ahead and close this. And I'll reopen it. And regardless of whether I was in Classic or the role-tailored client, I would get the same error message. So now I'm going to go to that agency order and see if I can post it. Okay. Now this part I haven't prototyped, so I'm not even sure if it will post, but it should. Aha! So now I got through one of those messages. I'm no longer getting the sales invoice header, but now it is saying that you do not have permission to read the cost allocation table. So in trying to post, it was trying to read another table. So again, this is an example of where I took care of one issue, but when the user tries to do it again, I get a second issue. And I can tell you the reason this is because this is new functionality that hasn't been added to any of our security roles yet. So again, if I wanted to add that to that posting role, because if I say, well, okay, when somebody posts, they're going to need to be able to do the cost allocation. So I would do a search for cost allocation, and I would jot down the number, 140-12470, and then I would find out if there are any roles that currently have that. So again, I'm going to go to my permissions table, run it, and I'm going to filter it for that particular table. And in this case, it looks like GL Setup has it, and looks like I've got the Ceres do not use, the roles that we're phasing out hasn't been transferred over yet. So again, if I look at this GL Setup role, I would need to determine, is that an appropriate role for this particular user? And probably not, given that it's set up and this user is just a user just going to be posting. So if we look here, this gives the ability for people to vary the accounting period, journal templates. So again, this would be something that would be appropriate for a system admin, maybe a controller, something along that lines, but certainly not for somebody who's just posting an agency or sales order. So in that case, we would want to add, with the next decision would be, do we add that permission to that posting role? And in my opinion, that would be appropriate. So let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to go to the very bottom, type in my number. Now, in this case, we got the error message. Did the error message say insert or read? Do you remember?
Read.
It said read. So in this case, I'm going to just give read and execute permission. So let's go ahead. So let's go into Classic. We'll log off of Classic, and we'll show the same process in Classic here. So I'm going to go to my order. This is my order that's been shipped. And I'm going to go ahead and try, oops, no, I don't believe that is the one. It's 13 actually. I'm on 14. There we are. that's been shipped, so I'm going to go ahead and try and post it. So now we're having an issue, same iterative process. So now we have the GL budget name table that needs to be read as well. And again, that's an additional functionality that hasn't been added to this. So you can see how, as it's a very iterative process, and basically once you would get the last one wrapped up, you would have the ability to use that same role. So once I've fixed this posting role, anybody who needs to post, all I need to do is grant them that role, and I've got it fine-tuned. Okay. So any questions? Okay. So let's talk about security filters. So security filters are an additional level of security. So let's take a look at, there's got to be a vendor one here somewhere. So read vendors. All right. So let's look at its permissions. So what we have here is a role that tells me I can read vendors. Well, when you read vendors or customers, agencies, donors, you don't just need to read a single table. There's usually a lot of additional lookups like location, like parent vendor, those types of things that need to come along with. But if you are saying to a user that you want to be able to limit, so let's go over here to purchase and we'll look at a vendor list. So let's say I want to limit my user to a vendor list, say a particular vendor posting group. Let's see if we've got vendor posting group on here. So let's say I want to limit them to general. I can go to my security filter for my table and I click on this little ellipse over here and I tell it that I only want it to look at vendor posting group equal to general and then click OK. So what that tells Ceres or NAV is when I attach this role to the user, they are only going to see vendors with a vendor posting group of general. So it acts as a filter, and it's a non-releasable filter. So if I have a posting group of general and employee, so this would be a good one to say, well, okay, I'm going to say that they can see a vendor posting group not equal to employees. So in essence, the standard vendor read role would not allow me to see my employee vendors. So if I wanted to be able to limit them in that way. And you can limit them by any table and or any field in the particular table. So the security filters, when it's done this way, is non-releasable. So if I give this user this security role, if they log off and log back on, when they go to vendors, they're only going to see vendors with a posting group not equal to employee. So usually we see security filters used on master records, customers, agencies, vendors, donors, items, if you're trying to limit what users can access. Now it's also important that if you do this security filter at a vendor role, that you have pairs. If you're trying to, if you've given somebody a vendor edit role, they probably also have the same permission in here that's added to allow them to insert, modify, and delete. So you need to make sure that if you are relying upon security filters, that they are filtering correctly on all the roles that you have assigned to that particular user. Now, I do believe that, if I remember correctly, Ceres takes the most restrictive role, so the fact that I've limited them to read of vendors with a posting group not equal to employee, regardless of if I forget to put the security filter here, NAV will automatically apply the most restrictive filter. So security filters are a really good way if you want to limit, access to master records. Particularly if you're trying to limit access to specific types of vendors or donors or customers, agencies, that type of thing. The important thing is also, if you do a security filter, to remember that you've applied that to that role, and you may want to modify the role description, the name, to indicate that there is a security filter attached to it. Because then a lot of times well, I can't see the employee vendors, and most common cause of that, if you didn't have a security filter, would be that the user has some type of filter on their page on. So it would be good to remember that you did add a security filter. And if you want to get rid of it, all you need to do is just delete it. Okay. So any questions? Any troubleshooting permissions issues that you've encountered that I haven't covered that would allow you to resolve it? Okay, terrific. If you come across a situation that you're trying to resolve from a security standpoint that you can't, so certainly feel free to email me, or and I can certainly suggest an area. Certainly suggest a go-forward path of what I would recommend. So thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, William.
Thank you.